Hey, check, check, check. Live from the studio. I'm Jimmy Selesky, and welcome to another installment of Thursday Thoughts. We've been going strong with this segment. This is the third Thursday in a row where I had thoughts. Can you believe it? And this Thursday, my thoughts center around the idea of language and how it is seemingly and debatably, and by debatably I mean certainly, being degraded purposely. Now, what inspired me to speak on this subject was really just going through my comment section. I've talked a lot about language over the past week and a half. We did a whole segment on the N-word yesterday, actually. Quite the move for me. And of course, on Tuesday, I spoke about the Israel-Palestine conflict in the aftermath of this botched hostage rescue mission by the IDF. And the reason why that in particular inspired me to speak on the degradation of language, it was the comment section. The comment section in Tuesday's video is rife with lingual jujitsu. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned before, and I'm not going to get into Israel-Palestine today. That's not at all the purpose of this podcast. But I will briefly restate that on Tuesday's episode, I did not purport to have an emotional investment in either side of that conflict. And that is true. I do, however, have an emotional investment in the mischaracterization and deception surrounding the facts of the conflict. I am emotionally invested as a matter of principle to make sure that people aren't lying or misrepresenting certain facts in order to advance their agenda or narrative. So in a way, my intent was kind of to play a referee. And what I noticed is that is extremely necessary for this conversation and every conversation, because what we have is a disagreement in the glossary of terms. So to briefly put a bow on the Israel-Palestine example that inspired me to do this show, I noticed that in that discussion, people use terms like occupying force, ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid state. And those terms have already set a premise for the discussion before you've even discussed it. Those terms carry with them a weight that already implies the conclusion in their definition. If we approach the conversation from the angle of this is a war, then the potential outcomes and potential direction of that discussion have vastly different avenues than if we immediately walk into the conversation accepting it as a genocide or an ethnic cleansing. Now, I'm not here to debate whether or not it is the case, because again, that's not what this video is about. What I'm here to do is to point out how language itself shapes a conversation. If I can get you to accept my premise that this, in fact, is a genocide, if I can walk into the conversation calling it a genocide and then we move from there, I have already brought the conversation 4/4 of the way home, almost, all the way home, before we've even had the first point of contention. So that is why it is necessary to have different words that mean different things. We talked about this on Friday in regards to racism. Now, the definition of racism still remains the normal accepted definition that we all know to be the case, which is, of course, prejudice or discrimination based on race. However, as we discussed in that episode, the stipulative definition, as it's called, meaning the definition of a word that is not official but is widely accepted to be the case. In this case, the stipulative definition of racism, pushed by many people on the progressive side of the aisle, is essentially power plus privilege, meaning that it's not merely enough to be prejudiced or discriminatory based on someone's race, but also that the person who holds those prejudice or discriminatory beliefs is in a position of institutional systemic power, i.e., a white person in America. A white person in America is historically in a position of institutional power or systemic privilege, according to the theory. And therefore, only a white person in America is capable of being racist by this definition. Otherwise, a person of a different racial background, Black, Latino, Asian, what have you, while they may display prejudiced or discriminatory thoughts and actions and words, this is not by that definition racism. So, in this new definition of racism, we have written out, we have precluded every other group of people in America except for white people from being racist. And as a secondary effect of that, we no longer have a word for when a non-white person is being racist. We don't have a word for that. Now, we used to have a word for an institutionalized systemic implementation of racism codified into our laws and society. That is called systemic or institutionalized racism, meaning that we have the word for racism, and then we specify the form of racism. Is it just a person being racist? Well, that's just racism. Is it a racist law or a racist system or a racist belief that is codified into society or the culture? Well, that is now a type of racism called systemic racism. So we have words for all of that. We also have the word prejudice, which does not just mean prejudice based on race. It means prejudice based on anything. You could be prejudiced off of literally anything. Anything that you prejudge for any reason is a form of prejudice. Racism is one of the infinite forms that can exist of prejudice. But now we no longer have that word to describe any person being prejudiced based off race. Again, that person, you'll talk to people that subscribe to this power plus prejudice definition of racism, and you'll say, okay, well, what do you call it if, let's say, a black person is saying discriminatory, prejudiced things about white people or towards white people? And they say, well, that's just prejudice. They're just prejudiced. It's like, yes, that you are correct. They are being prejudiced, but so is a white person who's saying racist things towards another race of people. That is prejudice, but more specifically, it's racist because their prejudice is based on someone's race. Likewise, that would and should be the case for any race of people saying anything towards any other race of people that is prejudice for that reason, based on race. But we have eliminated that from the conversation, or they're attempting to. And I say this is purposeful because what happens is, in these conversations, the stripping away of meaning from words, or the changing of meaning, completely changes the conversation. He who controls the glossary of terms controls the dialogue. Think of a guitar, for instance. The standard tuning of a guitar, 6 strings, is E, A, D, G, B, E. Each fret on the guitar represents 1/2 step. So, the average guitarist is used to playing in standard tuning, what we just read off, and there are specific chord shapes that every guitarist knows if they want to make a C chord, or a G chord, or a D chord, or an E minor, or any chord. You could pick up any guitar that's in standard tuning, and you could play those chords by simply making the shapes with your hand that you know to be the case for these chords. However, if you are to change the tuning of the strings, if you were to make the B string, I don't know, let's say an A sharp, or make the E string an F, now those same shapes no longer play the same chord. So someone can be making the same chord shape and be making a completely different sound. Likewise, this is a metaphor for language. By changing the definition of words, by untuning the definition of these words, somebody could be saying the exact same sentence, trying to convey the exact same idea, making the same metaphorical chord shape with their hands, and playing a completely different chord, saying a completely different thing. And if you can untune those strings badly enough, then you can make it near impossible to actually play any decipherable chord at all. And that is where we are. And this is not new. This is something that I think is most famously discussed in the George Orwell novel 1984. Now, of course, this book was written, I want to say, in the 40s or 50s. This was written a long time ago, where 1984, the year 1984 was a distant, far-off future. So he was writing this novel as this sort of futuristic, fictional, dystopian picture of what the year 1984 would look like as this communist, totalitarian society with complete control over their subjects. A single-party monopoly that was using propaganda and misinformation and intimidation tactics and violation of privacy and every other thing that goes along with a totalitarian state to control the people, to brainwash the people. And one of the most popular things from that book was this idea of newspeak. Newspeak is the language that the party of Big Brother, that's where the term Big Brother comes from, by the way. Big Brother's watching you, that's from the book 1984. Newspeak is the language of the party where they systematically changed the definition of words, removed words from the language, what they called old speak, simplified the language. So let me read you a quote here. This kind of describes their motivation, and it sounds eerily prophetic. Quote, "Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten." That's a powerful line. It's a powerful line because what it describes is exactly what we've been discussing up to this point. That by changing the definition of things or removing words in total, and I'll use this as an example. It is hard to imagine a feeling or an emotion that there is no word for. One of the most interesting examples of this, I find, in the English language is the feeling of secondhand embarrassment. That is a very common feeling that we've all experienced at one time or another in our lives. I experience it all the time. But the odd thing about that is, as common of a feeling or emotion as that is, we don't actually have, technically, as far as I'm aware, a true word for it. So what we have is like a compound word. It's embarrassment, yes, but embarrassment is typically an emotion that you feel for yourself. I am embarrassed. You can say, I am embarrassed for you, but that's a sentence. That's not a word. There is no word, an individual word, to describe embarrassment that you are experiencing on behalf of someone else. So we combine two words, actually three words, secondhand embarrassment. Now, in German, there is a word for that. I think it's like Fremdschuld or something like that. They have an actual word for it. And as is the way for, societies in general, especially with the innovation of the internet, where we are experiencing other people across the world far more often. We're seeing videos of people doing ridiculous shit that, prior to the internet, you're not going to see all these other people doing all these things all the time. So now the need for a term that concisely describes that feeling of secondhand embarrassment is more necessary than ever. And so the internet has done its job and society has done its job in creating that word. And now we have kind of taken a term that already exists and made it an adjective. So the word cringe is a verb. You cringe at something. Ugh. Cringing is something you do when you are experiencing secondhand embarrassment. That's generally the thing you do. If somebody's doing something in front of you and they're embarrassing themselves and you feel that embarrassment for them, you cringe. Oh, yikes. So it's a verb, but again, we didn't have an adjective to describe that thing. So we just took the word cringe and also made it an adjective. Now you can say that something is cringe, right? That would be like describing something that makes you happy as smile. Smile is something you do. It's a verb. You smile. It's also a noun, a smile. Someone has a nice smile. But the verb to smile, you smile when something makes you happy. If there were no word happy, then likewise, you may have to resort to saying, oh, this is such a smile moment. Luckily, we have a word for a smile moment. We call that a happy moment. Now, oddly enough, another example in language that I find incredibly intriguing is the word sonder. Such a simple word with such an oddly profound and complex definition. If you look up the definition of the word sonder, S-O-N-D-E-R, I'm not going to look it up right now, but to paraphrase the definition, it is the sudden realization that every individual in the world experiences life as the center of the universe and has equally vivid experiences and emotions and thoughts as you do. That's what the word sonder means. It's basically the experience that you are not the center of the universe and every single person around you also perceives of themselves as such. Everything that they experience is through their lens. Their experience is just as real and vivid as yours. Two-syllable word, sonder. Kind of crazy. It's actually, that's a realization that, I would say maybe far less people actually come to. I believe everyone at one point or another experiences that realization. Whether or not they hold on to it for any period of time is a second thing. But for the most part, we all have moments where we realize that, and the English language saw fit to give it a word. Now, you would think the word for that would be some crazy scientific word. Minimum 5 syllables, I would say. Nope, 2 syllables. Yet, secondhand embarrassment, we had to make up our own word, cringe. What's interesting about that word sonder is that if there were no word for it, the only other way to speak about it or to describe it would be to rattle off that 3-sentence definition I just gave you. And that is much more time consuming it leaves much more up for interpretation, because now instead of choosing one word that perfectly encapsulates the exact idea you're trying to describe, you are now trying to make a composite of multiple words that add up to describe this singular idea, which again makes the final idea that you're trying to communicate much more convoluted. It's like playing a game of telephone. The more words you have to use to describe something, the more loose ends you are leaving up for interpretation, because every single word has some level of connotation or interpretation. If I say the word conspiracy, for instance, conspiracy literally by definition just means a plan or action taken by a group of people conspiring together. That is a conspiracy. You are conspiring if you work with other people or entities to achieve a certain goal. However, the word conspiracy in American and just English-speaking culture as a whole has taken on a connotation with and become almost synonymous with conspiracy theory. So now when you think of conspiracy, you don't just think a group of people working together to achieve a certain end goal, conspiring. You now think a false and untrue lie or crazy idea about something that challenges the accepted narrative. That's what a conspiracy is in most people's minds. If you say, oh, that's a conspiracy, in people's minds, because we've been programmed to accept the change in this definition, we have been programmed to accept that conspiracy is almost synonymous with lie. It's not. It's not. But they have slowly degraded the definition. They've changed the glossary of terms. And now, as someone who likes to delve into quote unquote conspiracy theories on this channel, I am saddled with the burden of having to describe a conspiracy while also convincing you that just because it is a conspiracy, it doesn't mean it's not true. That's purposeful as well. And the other aspect of a word either losing its meaning or having its meaning altered, or just there not being a word in the case of secondhand embarrassment that exists at all to describe a certain emotion, is because this experience or emotion or thought that you are currently having does not have a word attached to it. It almost, in a way, unconsciously or subconsciously invalidates that experience. An example that I find very compelling is the example of how we see color and how societies have experienced color over millennia. And before I get into that, I just want to say one thing I've always kind of thought is that it's kind of interesting to imagine whether or not we all experience color the same way. Like, okay, I can look at the sky and you can look at the sky and we both will agree that it is blue. But that's just agreeing on the word we use to describe the color. Is there any real way to know if blue looks different to you than it does to me? We may both look at that red Solo cup and agree it's red, but what if that red Solo cup looks like what you would see as a blue Solo cup in my mind? Like, what if your red is my blue and my blue is your yellow? And like, how do we actually know? Like, we know that these colors all have specific wavelengths and frequencies or whatever, but there's no real way to know, as far as I'm aware, if we consciously perceive of those wavelengths as looking the same. It'd be so interesting to see the world through someone else's eyes, but I don't know if you can do that. It would be like trying to see someone else's dream. How are you going to experience what goes on in somebody else's head? But imagine if you looked through someone else's eyes and like all the colors were like completely different, but you just grew up with it that way, so you're used to it. Like, you're not walking around like, doesn't the world look weird? The ocean is red and the grass is purple. It's like, no, that's just like, maybe what I perceive as the green grass and the blue sky would be really fucked up looking to you. How do you know? It's kind of weird to think about that. And again, I'm not entirely sure that we actually have a way of truly knowing if that's not the case. But anyway, going back to the topic at hand in regards to color, this is an article from grunge.com. It says the real reason ancient people didn't see the color blue. It's like, what? How do you not see the color blue? What does that even mean? It turns out blue is a relatively recent phenomenon. Business Insider reported researchers learned of this when one scholar, William Gladstone, realized Homer used strange colors to describe certain things. For example, iron and sheep are described as violet, while honey is green. Black and white appeared hundreds of times, but other colors, red, yellow, and green, were rare. And blue, none at all. Gladstone decided to look at other Greek texts to test out a theory. The same result. Another researcher, Lazarus Geiger, wanted to know if other cultures failed to mention blue. Looking through Hindu, Chinese, Arabic, and Hebrew texts, Geiger found blue didn't figure in any of these writings either. It's not as if these other cultures didn't write about color, they just never used blue to describe anything. But one ancient civilization did. Science Alert wrote the ancient Egyptians knew about blue. The Egyptians, after all, were the only people who successfully created a blue dye. They also used the color in their makeup. Geiger learned that there was a pattern to how cultures started naming colors. First, they will identify black and white, or darkness and light. They move on to name colors for blood and wine, said Ancient Origins. This is followed by yellow and then green. The last color-related word to enter most ancient vocabularies was blue. These days, of course, we think of blue as an extremely essential color. It's one of the primary colors and is one of the many colors in the rainbow. But many cultures have a hard time distinguishing blue from other colors, and if they can't point it out, they will not have a name for it. Scientists agree. It's not that ancient cultures couldn't see blue, they just couldn't identify it as different from other colors, and therefore did not give it a name. Proof was sought for the theory. The Himba tribe of Namibia didn't have a word for green and did not distinguish blue from green. In 2006, researcher Jules Davidoff launched a project to test if they could see blue. Members of the tribe were shown a circle made of different squares. Each square showed a shade of green, with one being a blue square. They were asked to pick out the color that was not like the rest. To others, it wouldn't be hard to point to the blue square, but for the tribe, it took far longer. It appeared that they even considered the blue square as green, because some people chose a different square as the odd one out. The test showed that not only did the Himba tribe have a name for all shades of green, but that they considered blue as green, because they had no name for it. It's the same way some shades of colors don't get names until we identify them individually. For many people, tan was just brown until we started calling it something else, or that violet and purple are the same. So I find that wild on like several different levels. The idea that cultures across the world slowly evolved the ability to identify and distinguish between colors, not that our eyes got better, not that we suddenly were able to see more wavelengths of light or whatever, but that as language evolved, so did our perception of the world around us. Before the color blue entered into the vocabulary of the ancient Greeks, for instance, and according to this article, all the other cultures around the world at the time, they had no real distinction between the color blue and, let's say, the color green. It's almost impossible to imagine that someone wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a blue sky and the green grass. But now that I'm thinking about it, it's impossible to imagine growing up with a different perception that is not geared to perceive of those two colors as being distinct. Something that kind of makes me wonder a lot is that brown is actually just dark orange. Now, we don't think of brown as dark orange. We think of brown as brown, at least I do. because it has a separate name, I don't think of brown having really anything to do with orange. To me, and I feel like most people, nobody really thinks that. But that's because we gave it a separate name. Perhaps if there was no word for brown, I would just look at brown as a darker shade of orange. And perhaps in that same way, people may have looked at blue as just a different shade of green, which is what he describes when he goes to this Himba tribe in 2006, where they're shown a palette of different shades of green and then one being blue, to which any one of us who is familiar with distinguishing between these colors would easily identify the blue square from the other green squares of varying shades. They had a hard time with it, and sometimes they couldn't do it at all because their language didn't have a separate word for blue. So they were very keen at being able to identify all the different shades of green, but blue to them was just another shade of green. So again, you have to ask the question, is this an example of people's eyes evolving? Or is it an example of the idea that when something is defined and you know of it to be its own thing, that fine-tunes your perception of the world around you? And so it took a long time for cultures to distinguish blue as its own individual color, which of course it is. It's a primary color. It's more of a color than green, technically. Green is a mixture of blue and yellow. Blue is blue. It's not a mixture of anything. It's blue. But for whatever reason, people just saw blue as like a different shade of green. And then as we evolved and culture progressed and societies advanced, we were like, wait a second, this is like its own thing. And now, at this point in society, it's impossible for you or I to even imagine that you wouldn't see that as two different things. I think it would be so interesting to see through the eyes of people thousands of years ago who saw honey as green and sheep as violet. What the hell does that mean? Are they literally seeing things differently? I don't know. What I do know is that clearly the existence of these terms, like blue, like red, like yellow, the introduction of these terms into the vocabulary appear to affect people's ability to actually distinguish between different elements of their reality. If you have not yet introduced those terms, then people kind of just mishmash everything together. As you eliminate words from the vocabulary, you are actually eliminating potentially the brain's ability to even recognize this idea or experience or thought or emotion as a distinct thought, experience, or emotion. The same way, if you remove blue from the vocabulary, it appears that people lose the ability to distinguish that that was its own individual, unique color. It's amazing that language itself appears to fine-tune the brain. I talked about this with my friend Scott when he first got a motorcycle, and he was like, yeah, dude, it's like ever since I got a motorcycle, I'm always noticing motorcycles. And I obviously knew that he understood this, but we were just talking about it. I was like, yeah, it's like, it's obviously not that you're just suddenly coincidentally seeing more motorcycles. It's that your brain is in tune. You're consciously aware of motorcycles now that you drive one. You passed it by that many motorcycles all the time. You just never noticed it. Now that you're looking out for it, you notice it. And so now you think that because you're consciously recognizing more motorcycles, that the illusion is that you're suddenly coming into contact with more motorcycles. You're not. You're just noticing it more. But from your brain's perspective, there's no difference. What you notice is what you see. Likewise, all these different colors or all these different ideas and emotions that exist may not be as easily recognized or consciously observed if your mind is not tuned to observe them. And it's interesting that as society has evolved and progressed, we have constructed more and more refined terms to describe the world around us and our experiences within it. And that the introduction of these more and more refined and nuanced terms into our vocabulary has in turn made our experience more refined and nuanced. When you look around and you see people making a very blatant effort to control the glossary of terms, the language, when you see new terminology pop up every other year, now we use the term people of color, for instance. I've always found it amusing that the term colored person is extremely derogatory, extremely offensive. But if you simply flip the words around and say person of color, you are at the height of progressiveness. That's so silly to me. Person of color doesn't just apply to a black person or any other non-white person. It actually applies to all of them. So much like the definition of racism has been changed from just prejudice based off race, we have now, by definition, lumped all non-white people into one group, people of color. And this was not an accident, because if you align with an ideology that seeks to paint the dichotomy of the world as a picture of oppressor versus oppressed, as we discussed earlier in the week, then through a twist of language, you can conveniently invent a term that rids each individual group of people, be it black, Latino, Middle Eastern, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, whatever, and instead change the definition so that one word encapsulates all of them, and then you have just people of color and white people. You see? And so in an effort to unify and get the vote of all those people, they lump them all into one group that they can appeal to simultaneously and try to psychologically change people's perception of themselves. A Chinese person or a Japanese person or an Indian person or whoever should not perceive of themselves as a person of color. That is a massive dilution of their identity. It's a massively condescending way to look at yourself, much less have that be the way that society looks at you. To look at a black person and a Chinese person and a Latino person and just go, oh, you guys are all basically the same thing, right? You're just like not white people. That's not how it works. That's literally not how it works. But they've changed the glossary of terms and it is working. People are literally perceiving themselves like that. And then you take it a step further and you look at the pride flag and now they're going, oh, well, now biracial people and all people of color are also part of the LGBTQ plus move. What? That's all I want. What does race have to do with sexual orientation now? Why is that on the flag? Because at the end of the day, it's all about lowering the resolution of thought. Why do I say that? And I'll close with this, because this is what I'm building up to, or at least what I was trying to. When you look at an image, you watch like a show or a movie or whatever, we all understand resolution, right? 1080p is high definition. 720 is like, used to be what was considered high definition. 480 is standard. Anything lower than that is like unwatchable almost, like old brick phone resolution. And then you have 4K, which is like ultra high definition. And all of those resolutions are the number is representing how many pixels are used to generate the image. So in the case of 1080, standard high definition or whatever, I don't know how the exact math works. Like 1080 across 1920, whatever. Who knows? Doesn't matter. The point is, those numbers represent how many pixels are used in the generation of this image. And the more pixels that are used to generate a certain image, the more precise and detailed and recognizable that image becomes. So naturally, the less pixels you use to generate an image, the more grainy it is, the less detailed it is, the less you can make out certain things from other things, because you have less pixels to capture all the detail. And this makes logical sense. If I take a picture of a cobblestone street, for instance, and I take that image in 1080p, high definition, 1080 pixels by 1920 pixels or whatever it is, doesn't matter. I am going to be able to generate a pretty solid representation digitally of the image I just captured, because I have a bunch of pixels dedicated to capturing every single individual nook and cranny of this picture I took. If I lowered the resolution of this image to, let's say, 480, like half the definition or whatever would be a third, or I don't even know. Now each individual pixel is tasked with representing a larger portion of the image as a whole. So in the high definition picture, the 1080p picture, let's say, a pixel might only have to represent one little dot on a brick, one little individual speck or whatever on a brick. That's a whole pixel dedicated to just representing or portraying that speck. Whereas a lower definition photo, that same pixel, because there's less to go around, might be tasked with portraying a whole, like half of that brick is one pixel. And so what happens is, as you lower the resolution, you get a less and less clear image of what you're trying to generate, because you have less and less pixels dedicated to each nuance within the picture. And you can see how I'm using this as a metaphor for language itself. As you remove all the different nuanced words that we have that mean very similar things to each other or are opposites of each other, but within every single one of those words, there's a slight little difference in what it means or what context in which it is used or the connotations that it carries along with it, that you are, in fact, although conveying a similar meaning, regardless of whatever word you choose, you are, in fact, conveying a slightly nuanced or different meaning depending on the word you choose. And this is an example of a high resolution conversation. If, however, you remove from the vocabulary, from the lexicon, all of the nuance of language, if you take a word like racism and remove its true meaning and replace it so that now there is no separate pixel for systemic racism or institutional racism, that racism is now just one pixel that only means that thing, and now we don't even have a pixel for when a black person is racist because, racism is just systemic racism. When you remove the pixel for black person, Asian person, Latino person, Middle Eastern person, and you instead go, okay, we're just going to put one pixel in here that's people of color, what you have is a grainy, indecipherable picture of the world around you. And that is purposeful. They don't want the conversation to be high definition. They don't want the conversation to be high resolution. And going back to what we were discussing earlier, as to the why of that. We touched upon the idea that it's not just thoughts affect language, but likewise that language affects thoughts. As your brain becomes fine-tuned with the nuance of language through the use of different words to convey different ideas, your brain becomes more able to decipher between those different concepts and ideas. However, if those nuanced concepts and ideas are removed from the language, your brain is not trained to perceive of them. So it's not just a matter of reducing the conversation in the moment to a low resolution conversation where you have fewer and fewer words, aka pixels, to portray the idea that you're trying to portray. But even more nefarious is the idea that as we remove the words from the vocabulary, we have removed from your consciousness the ability to perceive of the nuance in any given conversation. You are not just looking at a low resolution picture. You in turn are being conditioned to see and think in low resolution. So I don't take this idea of defining a glossary of terms, making sure that we all understand, accept, and appreciate why these words exist, why they need to continue to exist, and why people that want to control the dialogue have the exact opposite interest. They want to give you a low resolution image so that you can't tell what you're looking at. Don't let them do it. Don't let them do it. Those are my thoughts on this lovely Thursday. My name is Jimmy Selesky. This has been another installment of Live from the Studio. Please tune in Monday through Friday for new content on this channel. Subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a comment, and until next time, peace.